It's a Saturday morning. There's a bowl of cereal in your lap, the kind that turns the milk a suspicious color. The TV is on and it's showing cartoons that, looking back, were probably a little unhinged. Your parents are somewhere in the house, not checking on you, not scheduling you, not optimizing your weekend with enrichment activities. You're just there, unsupervised, unbothered, completely free in that particular way that children in the 90s were free, which is to say, no one knew exactly where you were and no one was especially worried about it. If that image landed somewhere warm in your chest, you probably grew up in the 1990s, and this video is about you. Not just the nostalgia, not just the pop culture references and the frosted tips and the dial-up modem sound that lives rent-free in a specific corner of your brain forever. This is about what that decade actually did to the people who came of age inside it, the psychological fingerprints it left, the particular way it shaped how you think, how you relate to other people, how you handle uncertainty, and why, even now, something about the current world feels like it's running at a frequency you weren't quite built for. Because growing up in the 90s wasn't just a cultural experience, it was a developmental one. And developmental experiences, particularly the ones that happen between childhood and early adulthood, don't just become memories, they become architecture. They become the structure through which you interpret everything that comes after. Let's start with something that doesn't get framed as a psychological advantage nearly enough: boredom. If you grew up in the 90s, you were bored constantly, and that boredom was one of the most formative things that ever happened to you. There was no algorithmic feed waiting to fill every empty moment. There was no notification pulling your attention before it had time to settle. There was just the afternoon, stretching out ahead of you, with nothing scheduled and no screen offering to solve the problem of your unoccupied mind. And so, you did what humans do when they're left alone with themselves. You invented things. You explored. You got into situations of mildly questionable safety. You developed what psychologists call intrinsic motivation, the ability to generate curiosity and engagement from within, rather than waiting for something external to supply it. Research on boredom has undergone a quiet revolution in recent years. Studies out of the University of Central Lancashire and elsewhere have found that boredom, real, uninterrupted boredom, is actually a powerful driver of creativity and self-knowledge. When the mind isn't being fed, it starts feeding itself. It daydreams, it problem solves, it wanders into territory it wouldn't have found if it were busy being entertained. 90s kids got an enormous amount of that, almost by accident, simply because the alternative didn't exist yet. And many of them carry that capacity for internal resourcefulness into adulthood without even realizing it's unusual. But then something happened. Adulthood arrived, and with it a world that looked nothing like the one they'd been quietly prepared for. Think about the psychological whiplash of that transition. You grew up in the last decade of a particular kind of Western optimism. The Cold War had just ended, the economy was humming, the internet was this exciting new toy that hadn't yet revealed its full complexity. There was a collective sense, ambient but real, that things were getting better, that the future was going to be an improvement on the present, that the arc of things was bending somewhere good. And then, September 2001, the financial crisis of 2008, a global pandemic, a political and social landscape of fracture and noise, and a pace of change that makes the 90s feel like it belonged to a different civilization entirely. Psychologists who study generational trauma and collective experience talk about something called a cohort effect, the way that major historical events experienced during formative years shape the psychological baseline of an entire generation. For 90s kids, the cohort effect is particularly striking because the contrast is so dramatic. They were formed in one world and deposited into another, and that gap between the relatively analog, relatively unhurried, relatively optimistic world of their childhood and the high-speed, high-stakes, always-on world of their adulthood creates a very specific kind of psychological tension that many of them carry without having language for it. It shows up in interesting ways. There's the relationship with technology, for instance. 90s kids are genuinely bilingual in a way no generation before or after them quite is. They remember the before. They remember waiting for things, waiting for a song to come on the radio so you could hit record at exactly the right moment, waiting for a photo to be developed without knowing if it came out, waiting for a web page to load while the modem made its prehistoric mating call. That experience of waiting, of delayed gratification built into the infrastructure of daily life, did something to the reward circuitry of their brains that is genuinely different from someone who grew up with instant access to everything as a baseline. They have a reference point for patience that wasn't taught to them. It was just the water they swam in. And then there's the social dimension. 90s kids learned to be friends in a way that required more effort and more presence than friendship requires today. You couldn't text someone you'd just met. You had to remember their phone number, call their house, potentially speak to their parent first, and then actually show up in physical space and be together with no exit ramp. Friendships were slower to form and harder to maintain, and as a result, they often ran deeper. Research on attachment and social bonding consistently shows that effort and investment increase perceived value. The things we work for feel more significant than the things we're simply given. 90s friendships, forged in the analog world, often carry that weight, and many people who grew up in that decade find modern social connection, fast and frictionless and mediated by screens, quietly unsatisfying without being able to explain exactly why. There's also something worth saying about identity. The 90s was the last decade in which you could be a teenager without being publicly documented. Your embarrassing phases, your experimental haircuts, your absolutely unhinged fashion choices, your evolutionary political opinions, your cringeworthy diary entries. None of it was uploaded. None of it was searchable. None of it was permanent in any meaningful way. You got to be bad at being yourself in private and then quietly become someone better without anyone holding the receipts. That kind of developmental freedom, the freedom to fail and evolve without an audience, is something that developmental psychologists consider enormously important for healthy identity formation, and it is something that no generation coming after the 90s will ever fully have. Erik Erikson, the psychologist who mapped the stages of human development, argued that adolescence is fundamentally about the tension between identity and role confusion. You're trying on versions of yourself, seeing what fits, discarding what doesn't. That process requires experimentation. It requires the ability to be wrong about who you are for a while. 90s kids got that. They got to figure themselves out in the relative privacy of a world that wasn't watching, and many of them emerged from it with a solidity of self, a groundedness in their own identity that they don't always recognize as unusual until they see how hard that same process is for generations who came after. None of this is to say the 90s were perfect. They weren't. Or that nostalgia is always accurate. It isn't. Memory softens things. It edits out the boredom that wasn't productive, the loneliness that wasn't romantic, the parts of childhood that were hard in ways that had nothing to do with the decade. But what is true is that the specific combination of experiences that defined growing up in the 90s, the analog rhythms, the unstructured time, the pre-documentation freedom, the tail end of a particular cultural optimism, produced something genuinely distinct in the people it shaped. It produced people who remember what it felt like to be unreachable, who know what silence sounds like when it isn't filled, who learned without being taught that waiting for something is not the same as losing it, and who carries somewhere in the architecture of who they are a quiet knowledge that life doesn't have to move this fast to be full. That's not a small thing to carry. That might actually be exactly what the current world needs more of. Drop a comment and tell me the one 90s memory that just surfaced while you were watching this. I have a feeling the comment section is about to become a very specific kind of time machine. And if you want to keep exploring the psychology behind the generations, the experiences, and the quiet forces that made you who you are, stick around. There's always more to understand.